Welcome to the Conscious Community Podcast, brought to you by Conscious Community Magazine. I'm your host, Janae.
And I'm Spencer. Our guest this episode is Max Dashu, author of Witches and Pagans, Women in European Folk Religion, 700 to 1100.
Max is a noted historian, artist, speaker, and author. She founded the Suppressed Histories Archives in 1970 to research and document women's history from around the globe. We discussed her life's work, the history of Halloween, and her new book. Welcome, Max, to the Conscious Community Podcast.
Oh, hello. Thank you.
Did any particular person or event inspire you to study women's history?
Well, not any person for sure. An event, it's kind of... I really, when I was in college, there was no women's studies, and that was literally a joke, the idea of women's history. And, this was 1969, and I really wanted to know where the women were and whether there were any free women on the planet, because the way it looked from where I sat, it didn't look good. And so that was my starting point, was to research that. And I had an anthropology professor, so you could say a person, I don't even remember his name, but he was talking about matrilineal societies only in order to basically say that it didn't matter if societies were matrilineal or not, because all societies have always been male-dominated, all human societies. That didn't sound right to me, but I didn't know as much as him, so I'm kind of like, what is this? But I really perked up when he said matrilineal societies, because this was something I had never heard of. And, immediately from the phrase, I could see what it meant. And so what difference would that make if you were tracing descent in the female line? And so that was a starting point that I had of looking for matricultures. And in order to do that, I had to cast a much broader net, because there are, of course, all these other kinds of societies. And so that was what got me started. And it kind of ballooned from there.
So in your initial research, what drew you to European pagan culture? Well,
yeah, I did research all over the world, and that's what I'm still doing that. I mean, I'm really looking on a global scale at women's heritages, history, status, all of those things. But I am of European descent, and I was really interested in understanding what it was that happened in Europe to bring us to the past that we're at now.
I was going to say, that's actually why I got interested in European paganism, is because I didn't really feel that kind of on a aboriginal level, like my ancestors weren't Christians. And
well, exactly right.
I wanted to understand what my actual ancestors believed, and that's what got me into it.
And this for me as well. I really knew that there was something more than Christianity, and yet we were given nothing but Christianity. I mean, anything that we were given as European history, unless it was Greco-Roman, was Christian. And, I found that to be a very sterile set of archetypes, very limiting for women, certainly with the all-male priesthood and the all-male godhead. But, so I was always interested in pagan mythology, even as a child. And, of course, at that time, it was only given to us in the Greco-Roman form. But then as I became aware of what more was out there, that was something that I really wanted to document. And it's part of a larger story, too, for the world at large, because of the fact that Europe conquered all the rest of the world, essentially. And so the dominant ideology in Europe, in turn, imposed itself on other places as it had imposed itself in Europe in the early Middle Ages.
The quote from one of my favorite authors, the Roman Empire never ended. It's really like they kind of set up the prototype, and it's just been duplicated over and over and over.
Yeah, that's true in so many ways, because, the church ran by Roman law, and the church had a tremendous influence even on just the feudal rulers in the early Middle Ages. But, a lot of the words that we know, like diocese, a lot of the terminology that is now church terminology originated from the Roman imperial administration.
Well, I actually, my background is actually public policy, education-wise. I mean, I've bounced all over the place, but they taught us that at the beginning of our program, which is that the public sector in general is completely modeled on the Roman legion. That the Roman legions would go out and they would conquer, and then when they were in garrison and they didn't have any Gauls to kill, they would build roads. So the entire backbone of the civil service was what the Roman legions did when they weren't in combat. And that
right, and the road building
today,
also had military purposes as well.
Yeah. So, and we're really still operating on that kind of paramilitary model when it comes to like the public sector. It's still basically an army. You know, the Parks and Recreation Department is set up like an army.
Yeah. And that's true on multiple levels too, because of the way that another arena is law, and Roman law has massively influenced the way that all of the European law codes, and so that's another aspect. And when we look at the witches, Roman law was pretty tough. Both the Greeks and the Romans had judicial torture. And it's something that's very hard to discover a lot of detail about, except that it's in the sources. And so this is something that it's important when we study the history of witch persecution and the use of torture trials, then that comes in, because that is the model there as well.
Thought I just now, was there any persecution of women then in Roman society as witches?
Yes, but again, that's something hard to document. What we find more is stray mentions of some old woman being chased down the street, things like that. And there were persecutions of foreign religions. That's the thing that's the best documented. But there were a lot of witch hunt tropes already active in Roman society, because the thing we have to remember is that the Greeks and Romans were pagan, but they were also patriarchal. And so there's complexity there, because certainly the move to Christianity had a lot of negative aspects in terms of the totalitarian aspects. But when we look at the Roman Empire, it was pretty totalitarian in its own right.
So it was, I guess I should say, like, it was a society that was accustomed to unilateral mandates, and so switching over to Christianity was just like, okay, well, that's what the boss tells it to do.
I mean, the way that Christianity developed was an extension. As it became an institutional and imperial religion, it became an extension of Roman patriarchy. And the patriarchal aspect of this authoritarianism is not to be lost, because, we have our patricians running Rome, and all of that stuff is already in place. And the way that Christianity developed, to the extent that you had this religious ideology of one true way only, that became a platform for an extension of rulership and authority over all aspects of people's lives. Not only that you could be enslaved by military forces, but there were all these other ways that they began policing people around sexuality, around religion, certainly. And there's a beautiful appeal that Symmachus made to the Senate in the early 400s, when the Senate was in the process of Christianizing everything and outlawing everything and closing the temples. And he pled that the truth cannot be reached by one way alone. And he was pleading for tolerance of the pagan traditions. But the authoritarianism that had developed in Rome by that time was something, with the emperors and with this military state behind them, had become so intense that this just extended itself. And this doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the Christianity practiced by, first, the earliest followers of Yeshua of Nazareth, and second, various other Christian sects that were really ethnic Christianities scattered around, ancient Arabia and Bulgaria. You've got the Collyridians, who are, they're not holding mass. They're having ceremonies with bread offerings to Mary, So there were a lot of tendencies within Christianity, and what happened is that the religion, as it got defined by the Roman state, including the fact that you have these elite Roman citizen men saying, these are the books that are the canon, and only these can be considered valid Christian texts. And by one stroke, they wiped out the entire Gnostic literature. As it happened, some of it survived in jars and by other means. But the authoritarian aspect of it is really important. So that's like the formative phases. You could call it the prehistory of the Christian right, because there's a lot of these developments that then this template, Rome falls. And this template gets carried forward into feudal Europe with Rome as the model. Mm-hmm. And so here you've got a bunch of Franks and then Germans founding a Holy Roman Empire. They were looking back fondly at this lost imperial glory, and they wanted some of it.
Well, I think that's one thing people miss is the rise of fascism in Italy and Nazi Germany was supposed to be a reincarnation of the Roman Empire.
Right. Well, and the Third Reich, the First Reich was the empire of Otto the Great, so-called. I don't like to call any of these guys greats, but you have these genocidal wars that are being fought first by Charlemagne and later by Otto and his successors against the Saxons and then against the Wends and the Czechs and various other peoples who in the 900s were still pagan, 800s and 900s. So you have these imperial wars, and this is an aspect of Christianization in Europe that most people don't even realize, that there were crusades against the pagans. Mm-hmm. Starting with, especially with the Saxons and then the Wends. These are Slavic people that lived in what is mostly in now East Germany, parts of Poland.
I don't know if you're familiar with Dan Carlin, who does Hardcore History, the podcast. His most recent episode is about the Celtic genocide, and the number he cites is that when the Romans came through Gaul, they annihilated a third of the population and they enslaved another third. And at that time, that would have been something like 4 million people. So it was, and this is before industrialization, before machine guns and gas chambers and everything the Nazis came up with. They managed to wipe out 4 million people.
I would be very interested in seeing his documentation for that. I mean, there's no question that the Roman conquest of Gaul was brutal. And just like everywhere else, part of the Roman model of war, because Rome was a slave state, and we can't forget that part, that the war captives were enslaved. And, there was a special official that went around and held auctions of the captives to slave dealers. And then this is why you had not only Gauls, but Syrians, lots of Syrians taken captive. In fact, Sicily was basically, the majority of people there were enslaved Syrians, and also from other places, North Africa and so forth. And so, and what's interesting about that story is that there were shamanic goddess movements that led the slave insurrections in Sicily. There were 2 of them. And I don't have the names at the tip of my tongue, but I'm going to be talking about that in Volume 5 of my series, Secret History of the Witches.
Similarities between European folk religion and Hinduism. Do you feel that they are both spanning from an original Indo-European origin?
In many cases, yes. I mean, you can see that most clearly with the Baltic traditions, the Lithuanians and the Latvians, whose languages are also very much closer to Sanskrit than, say, Celtic or Germanic. But there are some themes, some through lines in there.
Again, I don't have the documentation or the citation, but I've always heard that ancient Norse and Sanskrit have a common root language.
Well, they do. I mean, these are all Indo-European languages.
Yeah.
Okay, so the Indo-European family, and that's where the name is taken from India and Europe, right? So we have everything in that family from Irish and Latin and Greek and Germanic and Slavic and Baltic and Norse and Armenian to Iranian and Toharian, which is in Central Asia, and Sanskrit. And Sanskrit, of course, is kind of a literary language, but you have all the other Indic languages. And so there are some amazing parallels in some of the... It's really interesting because at the 2 extremes of that expanse of land, across Eurasia, you have the Irish and the Sanskrit literature, the Vedic literature. There are certain parallels there that are quite striking, and there's been some scholarship about this, in terms of topics like the indestructibility of spirit. There's like a 3-line quote that each of them have that are very close. And so, there are these very deep substrates, and I think that if the Gauls had not been so thoroughly Romanized, we would have a lot more information about that from that side. Because, there were the Druidic traditions, which we know about mainly from Britain and Ireland, Very little survives from Gaul. There's very little written in Gaulish, even to the point they don't really know the language very well. But they had a calendar called it's an inscription called the Coligny calendar, found in France, and it shows this very elaborate year system. And you can see there some parallels, like, for example, the word Samhain, or, it would be spelled to sound more like Samhain, if we were going to pronounce it anglicized. There's a Samonios in the Coligny calendar. So you can see that some of the same holidays were used by the Gauls as were used by the ancient Irish and Scots.
Sorry, I was going to say that relates to another question I was going to ask about those various Day of the Dead type festivals around the world at that time. And do you feel, or is there evidence that they all stem from one original festival?
I think they arose independently. I mean, there are cases like the ones I've just been describing where there are clearly historical lines of transmission or diffusion. But in a lot of cases, I think it has more to do with human experience and things kind of arising independently in vastly different places, especially given the fact that some people are living in the equatorial tropics and some people are living in the far north, which has a whole lot to do not just with weather and economy and, whether you're farming or not and hunting and gathering, but also with calendrical things like, if you're around the equator, then the solstice and equinox are not a big deal because you're pretty much, there's not a lot of pitch to the, you know what I'm saying?
Yes.
The length of the day and night is not so dramatically different.
Can you walk us through some of our American Halloween traditions, such as bobbing for apples, lighting pumpkins, wearing costumes? Where is the historical evidence or origin of these?
I grew up in West Chicago, Illinois. And
we're in St. Charles.
Oh, are you really?
Yes, our magazine is Chicago.
Oh, amazing.
Yes.
Well, then we're very close. We're as they say in Yiddish, Landsmann. But anyway, then that in the Midwest, Halloween is a serious holiday, and it's lost the religious dimension, and it's got a lot of mediatized addition of, really ghoulish things. I mean, it's kind of changed in some ways. But the pumpkins were based on the fact that people used to carve lanterns out of turnips in Ireland, because they didn't have pumpkins. Squash is an American plant family. And so they had those lanterns. And it was this idea of a festival of lights because we're going into the dark of the year. And so that part kind of, the idea of having jack-o'-lanterns burning, that's definitely there. The trick-or-treating does have European origins. I think it's shifted a lot. It's, for one thing, being much more commercialized. There were a lot of divinatory customs in places like Scotland on Samhain. And this whole idea of this holiday of All Hallows Eve being the time when the veil between the worlds became thin. The spirits are in movement. You can have interchange with the spirit worlds. And so that idea carried over one way or the other, the idea that spooks are abroad. The association of witches has become more problematic because usually they're very demonized versions of witches, and based mostly on witch hunt period symbolism, like the kinds of hats that you see the witches wearing are like from the 1700s in English society, different things like that. But flying on broomsticks, and even older than that, flying on the backs of animals, is something that I document a lot in my book, Witches and Pagans, talking about spirit flight in European traditions, going back as far as we can reach, basically, to some of the earliest recorded oral traditions. And so the idea of spirit flight gives us this idea, gives us a shamanic take on Halloween, that there's a possibility to travel the worlds. Not only that the spirits come to visit you and that the ancestral dead could have a visitation at the home, which is another theme that's older, but also that you could visit the spirit world and go on these journeys. So this is why the idea of the witches flying across the skies. And in Ireland, there are other much more. I mean, those of us, we're living in North American settler society, and so there was an attenuation and a thinning of some of the ancestral traditions because we're not doing the cultural full bore anymore. It's very much a melting pot, in a lot of ways. But if you go on the ground in Ireland, there are specific places that have folklore connected with Samhain. So there are things that were written down 1,000 years ago that talk about particular megalithic sites that were said to become gateways or portals to the other world. And Samhain was one of the prime times for people to visit them. So there's a Irish poem, a saga called the Echtra Nera, and Nera goes into the fairy mound in the dead of winter and brings out, might have even been on Samhain, I don't remember which, but it was that time of year when things aren't really growing in Ireland, and brings out fruits that would only be summer fruits. So there's this idea that by entering into this old megalithic chamber, a funerary chamber, but also the home of the ancestral beings, he's going outside of time and space and is able, therefore, to transcend those divisions and bring back fruits. This is a very common theme in the fairy traditions of Europe generally. So that a traveler who winds up getting caught up in the fairy dance there in a fairy ring or around a megalithic circle and is having the time of their life dancing away, and the night ends finally after much carousing and feasting and all of this and the most enchanting music that anyone ever heard. And then they come back and several hundred years have passed and nobody recognizes the traveler. And, they don't see anybody that they know either. And someone says, oh, yes, my grandfather used to say that there was a person by that name who disappeared many years ago. So there are all these fantasies of people visiting the other world.
I was going to, this occurred to me when you were talking. One thing that I've often wondered about is that you look at Central America, you look at Mexico and the Day of the Dead and how North American tribal cultural practices were folded into the church. I think I was watching a lecture of yours and you had mentioned that, how, the locals didn't want to give up their traditions, and the Catholic Church begrudgingly, rebranded them in the
right
as Catholic traditions. And it's very clear that the same was done to European pagan traditions. It was much more recent, I think, that they did it in Central America, and you definitely have people, the traditional tribal religion being kept alive kind of underground, and that's kind of reemerged. Like I know people from Mexico who are practicing what to them is they've never stopped practicing their ancient Mixteca traditions kind of in secret and disguised.
Yeah.
And now they're less persecuted, they're able to kind of bring it back into the open. Do you think that all this time in both former Roman places and in other parts of Europe, do you think that there is any surviving or was any surviving pagan practices in secret? Because I've often kind of wondered if maybe within like the church that there are or were enclaves of old Roman paganism or enclaves of Celtic paganism, that hid underground. Because you look at like the witch hunts in Salem or something, my imagination goes to, well, there could have been a lineage of witches that made it over, to the New World. Like, would you think those witches being hunted in Salem could have been pagans themselves? Or do you think that was just a Christian hysteria witch hunt?
Yeah, it was a Christian hysteria, and it was in large measure also misogynist hysteria. I mean, these dynamics of persecution had gotten certainly formed by the persecution of pagan religion. And I think that in the early Middle Ages, and even in some pockets in the later Middle Ages, you still do have the survival of pagan ways. We would A lot of times people want to think about it as an intact religion that was an entire system completely distinct from Christianity. And I think that given the political situation of the peasantry at those times, that would be that would be a hard ask to actually see that happen. But what you do see is aspects of paganism surviving. And, there are folk practices. Maybe the same people are going to Mass, but they also believe in Frau Holle, if they're in northern Germany, or in Frau Perchta in Austria, and different regions have their witch goddesses. And there were, especially around the winter nights, there were ceremonial practices in the dark of the year that they held, that some of them still survive today. The Perchtenlauf and the races of the Perchtas are still celebrated in Austria. And to a large extent, they've been emptied out of a lot of the spiritual significance. Some of it's still there, certainly, but it's all had to deal with the fact that Christianity was the dominant religion. So it could not be allowed to exist as a competing religion per se. It could be something that people did, and maybe they didn't talk about it. So this is where you hear a lot about the famtrads, like family traditions in the neo-pagan movement, is that there were specific practices, beliefs, spells, customs that people followed, even though you could not really say that there was an entire culture that was practicing a religion completely distinct from Christianity, if that makes sense to you. But there's a lot of these survivals.
Some of the Irish and Scottish kind of clan heritage type stuff gave me that impression. We went to Renaissance Fair last week, and that I was looking at, because we were coming up on this interview, I was looking at kind of through that lens, and I was like what, why would all these heraldic coats of arms and stuff, why would they have these kind of the Celtic knots and the the dragons and stuff like that? That's all pre-Christian stuff.
It is, although I gotta say, the
style of that artwork is all pre-Christian stuff.
Right, but I gotta say that the Ren Fair is very much populated by a lot of pagans, so that they're also selecting for pagan content in their heraldry, as opposed to the lions and the hawks and the various patterns that were more general in Christian heraldry, which still nevertheless has elements in it that are much older than Christianity.
Okay.
So
it's a little selection bias there going on.
Yeah.
And the church art and architecture in Europe often depicts pagan themes, which relates to what we were just speaking of. Do you believe that they did this in order to kind of sneak in the old tales, or were they meant to be tales of cautionary tales, saying, "Oh, don't go this way"?
Both, actually. Yeah, it happens in different ways. Certainly there were very explicit instructions from the Pope himself, and what was it, Gregory the Great is writing to the English missionaries and saying, well, destroy the idols, but don't destroy the temple, make it into a chapel. And there was this very deliberate attempt to supplant the old ways with Christian models. And this happened in a lot of sacred sites, so that they are taking over the area near the spring that had been, for who knows how many generations or centuries or even millennia, there had been a sacred spot, among the people of that place. But now it's being renamed after the Blessed Virgin or some bishop, put a Christian label on it. And a lot of times there was a alchemy that happened here, because it wasn't only that the clergy were superimposing their Christian template, which they were, but also people would mythologize the saint that they picked out. Like somebody say, okay, we're going to rename this after Saint so-and-so, Saint Catherine or whoever. But then the people would wind up working through centuries and through stories and so forth. They would start working their own legends about the bear woman or the woman with the geese or whatever it was, so that eventually you have, Saint Ursula or whoever it is, combining some of those archaic symbols in her own stories and her own, the statues of her and so forth, so that it was altered by, a Romanizing and a Christianizing lens. But there was also a way where an illiterate person walking into the church could still see the woman with the bear, or whatever animal it was, or whatever other kind of mythical context there was. And like, there's a lot of stories about female saints who had caused springs to spurt forth out of the earth. And in some of the stories, they're taking their distaff or their spindle, and they're striking the earth with it. And so the distaff is a really important wand of power, shamanic wand in pagan European tradition, particularly around the women shaman themes. And so this turns up in these sort of creative stories, because it's a symbol that transcends goddesses, priestesses, witches, and saints, the whole spectrum. The process of Christianization is very complex. It goes on over a long, long period of time, and it's not all one time. Like, there are areas in France and Switzerland were being Christianized in the 400s, 500s, 600s. But then you get over into Eastern Europe, and, Lithuania did not officially Christianize until close to 1400.
When did Romania go through that process? Would that have been about the same time?
Well, Romania had officially been Christianized earlier. They were under the Byzantine rule for a long time. The Balkans are a special case because one of the differences that we see even among Christians is that the Catholic Church was able to be far more repressive toward the old culture, toward the old religions, we could call them, than the Orthodox Church. And this was partly because Eastern Europe was much more vulnerable to invasions from Asia. You had the Mongols, and you had the Turks, and you had the Ottomans in the Balkans, and all of this. And so they were fighting on several fronts, and they didn't have the same ability as they did in France or Germany, for example, to get really military around this repression.
Their police state resources were being used fighting off external.
Yeah. So one of the ways that this is reflected is that Orthodox Balkan countries, Serbia and Macedonia, Bulgaria, and to some extent also Romania, they did not have witch hunts at nothing near the same degree of witch hunts. I mean, there may have been occasional persecutions. It's hard to document, but not at the same level as happened in the Catholic world. And so, there's a couple dynamics going on there that help to explain why that is. But anyhow, as a result, the Balkans retained a very vivid pagan practice. In some of the back countries, areas of Bulgaria, you have female shamanic healers, and, you have a lot of trance ceremonies and sacred dance and things like that going on. Although this is something that it was very difficult to wipe out also in Scotland and some of the other Celtic countries. So, for example, you have fairy healers being arrested as witches in the persecutions of the 1500s and 1600s in Scotland. And we have some of their trial records. And this one was a midwife who was said to have relations with the fairies. And another one is a healer that, was using certain kinds of basically animistic medicines. So you can see that these folk practices were still around. Now, if you had gone there and with a microphone and been able to interview those people, they wouldn't have necessarily said they were pagan, because that was now a term that was pejorative. And it could also get you in a lot of trouble. But if they got to know you and trusted you, then you would see that they were carrying out these practices that worked a lot with the land spirits, with the herbs, with curings that involved gathering water from the crest of 9 waves, as we see described in one of the witch trials of an old woman in Orkney Islands. So, all of this persisted. That's what's really been stunning to me, is the degree to which folk culture is conservational. I don't mean conservative, although it can be that too, but that they really don't want to let go of their beloved customs and beliefs and stories and symbols. And so they often find a way to get those to survive.
I had a thought the other day that gypsy culture in Europe has become kind of like a battery for pre-Christian culture, that you see like fortune telling and, all these, tarot cards and crystal balls and all this kind of stuff in gypsy culture. And I'm wondering I'm wondering how that has, what the connection is there. Like, there's got to be some kind of, you see those pagan elements, and I'm wondering if like maybe itinerant travelers, people who circus folk, people, peddlers and such that moved around, maybe were able to escape the scrutiny that somebody who lived in one spot would have had by their neighbors as far as converting to Christianity. And maybe that's one of the reasons.
Well, that's certainly true. I mean, they're basically marginal people to the society, and so all kinds of subcultures can exist inside those mobile groups that are not tied to the land. But with the case of the Romani and the other gypsy peoples, you have also this dynamic of the fact they were actually of Indian origin. And the fact that they do palmistry before they were doing cards. I mean, tarot cards are relatively late. They were doing palmistry, and that's very much an Indian practice. And so they were bringing their own culture with them out of the northwest of India. They were refugees from conquests that happened there about 1,000 years ago. And they wind up wandering across Persia and into, the story says that they went to Egypt, but a lot of them wound up in Eastern Europe, but they were all over Europe. And so, and they were certainly not originally a Christian society, culture, although they've sort of assimilated to, the Sara Lacali, the Black Sarah of southeastern France, and at Camargue, is an example of the way that the Romani culture has fused with sort of a Catholic, not very Orthodox Catholic tradition. But the tarot cards, then, on the other hand, see, a lot of the people who have studied this about tarot cards talk about West Asian origins for some of these customs, the use of divinatory cards, and it's all kind of very murky. But by the 1300s, you have tarot cards being created and exchanged, and then the tradition grows from there. And even playing cards, falling out after that, were used and still are as divinatory tools, even without all the drawings and symbols. Okay, this is the Eight of Hearts. That's what this means. And so you'll see pictures from the time of the French Revolution of old women telling fortunes using decks of cards. There's a lot of other kinds of divination that are, I think, more original to indigenous Europe. And we have descriptions from the Romans of women who used to gaze into the eddying waters of a river in order to foresee things. And I talk quite a bit. There's a whole chapter in Witches and Pagans that talks about the Völler, the staff women, as that name indicates, shamanic seeresses in Scandinavia, the Norse world. And these were oracular women. They had not just divination, but prophetic traditions. And the prophets were women. And so not all women were prophets, but the great majority of prophets were female. And so I've tried to reconstruct a lot of what that tradition looked like. And one of the things that they engaged in addition to these ceremonies where there would be entrancing songs with special melodies that would be sung in order to assist their entry into trance, just like shamans in northern Asia do. But also there were individual people could go on a kind of vision quest sitting out on the land. And that was literally what they called it. Utiseta means sitting out. And so there was a practice that involved going out into nature and sitting with attentive mind and releasing away all of your own preoccupations, all your mental cogitation, all of that attached energy of your life, letting that flow away and letting what's happening in nature enter you. and the life force that's present, sitting out on a rock or besides a spring or in the forest or whatever the place was, and basically meditating. Could be chanting, could be in silence, could be sacred dance, a lot of things in that practice. But there was that seeking practice, and this was considered to be a way of opening to the greater source of wisdom.
Really amazing how we're finally coming back to that after 2,000 years or more of rationalization, or over-rationalizing everything, just to, mindfulness being more in the moment.
Yeah. Well, there's an interesting concept. I'll have to look this up because I've forgotten who said it, but there's some famous thinker that talked about this process that he called disenchantment of the world. And so, in many ways, the age of reason was a good thing in that, it brought a critique of the witch hunts, for one thing, a critique of church doctrine, which was very much needed, but it also involved a move away from a magical consciousness or a sense of the numinousness of reality, so that now everything was being framed in a mechanistic construct that we're all machines, the universe is a machine, physics is all mechanical, and it was very linear. And so along with letting go of the church, they were also letting go of soul, and I think that there's a way that human beings can be very polarized in their thinking. And so for these Europeans, it seemed like a necessary process for them to let go of the authoritarian dogmas of the church, but they didn't realize that by doing so, they were also repudiating what they called the superstition of the peasantry. And some of that so-called superstition was folk wisdom, was invaluable oral tradition, was ceremonial practice that had a lot of value and a lot of time behind it, a lot of time depth to it. And so, they repudiated all of that. And so it only really around the turn of the last century, as physicists began to discover that the mechanistic model breaks down when you get to the subatomic level, and there's all these other levels of just on the level of physics where things are indeterminate. And, we're talking about probability curves instead of like absolute. The Greeks said the smallest possible piece of matter was the atom. And then the atom got broken up into its subparticles. And so we had electrons and neutrons and all that. And so then, the scientists were thinking we're very wise because now we really have finally broken down the ultimate constituents of matter. But guess what? Then they started finding all these gamma particles and quarks and different things, and it all kind of came apart until finally you have the physicists saying things that are starting to sound very much like Taoist or Hindu mysticism, and so it went full circle in a way.
Yeah, that's something that I've often repeated, that like I think you're doing 20,000 years of human history a great disservice if you think these people were stupid,
right?
And that modern man is just and is the first to ever. It's very, very Eurocentric, very Western centric, very, very like that everybody who ever came before us was ignorant and stupid and superstitious, and it's like. I actually, when I look at like paganism, I see all these metaphorical ways of describing reality. Yeah. And that, if you talk about, like something having an animal spirit or something having, the nature of something from nature, or a person having some nature, like it is a very like, it's an accurate way to describe like the dynamics between things that are happening. Maybe your two brothers, they fight like a cat and a dog, or you can describe the interrelationships between really abstract concepts using these kind of like Western culture when this, in the 19th century, when we started fetishizing all this stuff from the East, we made it so like mysterious and arcane and magical when it's really describing very real phenomena. It's like, these people weren't stupid. They were out in nature. They were observing things. They were seeing how things worked. Just because they didn't use the language of post 18th century science doesn't mean that they were wrong about.
Right. I mean, it's interesting. I always think of the story of the chemist, I can't remember who it was, who was trying to figure out the structure of hexane. And he couldn't get it, and he couldn't get it. How do the molecules fit together? And finally, he had a dream where a snake was eating its own tail. And then he realized it goes in a circle, And so there are things like that even for a scientist, their dreaming nature can reveal to them truths about the nature of reality that are helpful in the science.
And that symbol you mentioned, the snake eating itself, the Ouroboros, that's repeated all over the world. Like I was doing my own research one night at 2 a.m. and I started thinking about that because I was thinking about my dad who's passed away, and he always reminded me of that symbol. Like he taught me about it when I was little, and I just started looking it up, and it is that symbol is all over the world. And it, like, if you start looking at some of the models of like multidimensional space and like, the torus and like these modern day physics models of how more than three-dimensional space is shaped, or like a way to visualize it, it looks like an Ouroboros. It's this twisting around, Mobius strip kind of thing going on. And you're like, wow.
Well, and all the spirals, all the galactic science and black holes, it's all spirals, or some kind of form of, what do they call it now? It's a toric. I forget the terminology for it, but yeah, there are ways in which, there's meaning to everything, and there's consciousness to everything as well. And I think that was one of the big losses of the rationalist revolution, was that they were insisting on mind only, a particular kind of linear mind, and not an awareness that integrates the full capacities and faculties we have as humans. Because we have two sides of our brain, and not only the rational, but that other dreaming side. And so you lose out if you're trying to restrict it only to the one. And I think authoritarian systems, they insist on that. They insist on a completely monochrome view, or a polarized view. It's either black or it's white. And yet reality has all these layers of complexity to it, and so with the truth of mythos is that you have people using, and this is what all the mystics have done, is they use metaphor. I mean, even Yeshua of Nazareth was using parables all the time.
Yeah.
Because it's easier to show people and teach them with an example than to give them a bunch of abstractions. And then everybody winds up arguing because they're all lost in the abstraction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's when I was reading the Bible as a kid, it was like, oh, it's very obvious the lesson that he's trying to impart through this parable. And then I hear other people describing it, and they're maybe not quite on the level of being able to think metaphorically the way handle the interactions of metaphors, and they're arguing about whether or not this is telling us that we should give bread to people or whatever. And it's like, that's not the point of the parable. Mm-hmm. Like, the point of the parable is this, but like you're arguing over the literal details of the story and whether or not this or this was the meaning, and that's just a symbol for this concept. So.
Right. I mean, what is the actual intent of the story? Yeah. Yeah.
We would like our readers of the magazine to know that your book is part of a series. Would you like to tell us about that series?
Yeah, it's called The Secret History of the Witches, and originally the book was going to be just this one volume that I just published, which is called Witches and Pagans, Women in European Folk Religion. And this volume focuses in specific on about 700 to 1100. It's the early Middle Ages. But the whole series is basically trying to describe what you asked about earlier. What's the whole scope of the evolution, or you could call it the devolution of Europe, the cultural shifts that went on, and how did women's status change? Witch persecutions are a pretty severe example of not that there were no men victimized, but it really was predominantly a persecution of women. How did that come to happen? What were the forces that led up to it? And so, I do start back in there with, like, the current volume I'm working on is about what the Greek reality, the Greek world. and how some of it's about goddess traditions and things like that, but I also do talk in there about witch persecutions and some of the patriarchy that was already present at that period in European culture. And so then I move forward in time, the Italians and the Romans, and then of course the whole story of Christianity in all its complexity and the way that became the imperial religion. The institutional Christianity became the imperial religion, and the persecutions then of Jews and heretics and women and pagans. So that you've got this has been something that really was not known up until then in the world, was the idea that somebody would try to prevent you from practicing your religion. Was going to try to dictate what you believed. Mm-hmm. You could have people being enslaved and things like that, but no one ever really thought that they could control your mind at that level. So this was like a new development. And then we go into the early feudal period and, the wars against contraception. This was part of the Christian repression, the priesthood believing that for women to drink contraceptive potions was literally homicide. This is something that continued to be a theme in later church doctrine. And this current volume, has the most concentrated documentation of what did the ethnic folk religions look like in Europe. In a way, it's kind of an ethno-history because this is all very difficult information to dig up. You have incantations from herbal manuals, and you have the shamanic wands of the Norse women, and you have stories about women who went to sit by the waters and gaze into the spring and listen to the spirit of the fountain transmit wisdom to them. There's a lot of things here which are really not available to people in most sources that you find on European culture, medieval or otherwise. They're in specialized studies. And so what I've done, I've translated a lot of it. I've brought it into one place with pictures. There's a lot of illustrations there to show you what the culture looked like. And, so what did the Norse practice look like? And what were the Frankish and the German traditions? And what is all this about the Earth Mother sitting under a tree with a serpent at her breast? And how did that symbolism change in church sculpture over a couple of hundred years to the figure of Luxuria, where now it becomes the symbol of lust, and so she's demonized? That process of demonizing, and especially the whole construct of devil worship, where goddesses who are still in the period of this volume, at least, in witches and pagans, being described as goddesses. Eventually, when you get to the later volumes of my book, when we're looking at the 1300s and so on, they're not talking about goddesses very often anymore. They're talking about the devil. And so you have this template of diabolism being lowered over European culture. And that had very negative impacts on people who practiced the folk tradition. It did also on women, and it also winds up creating a ready-made template for conquest. Because if the religions of non-Christian peoples are devil worship, then first they impose that in Europe, and then Europe goes out and conquers the rest of the world. And so they're seeing Native Americans and Africans and Filipinos and Pacific Islanders all within this same framework with this concept of devil worship. So the conquerors are saying, we have to destroy these religions. We have to convert these people, just as they had done in Europe. So there's a cultural repression aspect that gets folded into the European conquests.
That's actually an aspect that occurred to me when I kind of started discovering paganism and researching it and thinking about my ancestry. I was like, wait a second. My ancestors from Ireland and Romania and Germany and Sweden and Norway, and my ancestors were Aboriginal peoples that were oppressed too. So
once upon a time,
time, like in a way, it's kind of like it kind of flipped the script, and it's like, instead of thinking of myself as like a European who came here and oppressed the Native Americans. Now I'm like, well, if you could wind it back far enough, my ancestors were going through the exact same process, a couple hundred years earlier.
Yeah, exactly. There's definitely some very strong parallels there. For example, and I talk about this a lot in this book and also in Volume 6, which is not out yet. You will see examples of the penitential books being used as a way to suppress the folk religion of the common people. And so basically they're interrogating people and saying, well, do you perform this ceremony? And if so, you have to do penance. And is there any woman who does this ceremony in honor of the fates or whatever it is? So it was kind of a church-run cultural revolution. But what ends up happening is that in California, when the Spanish came in and were colonizing the Chumash people in the Spanish mission system in Southern California, they used penitential books for the same purpose, which was to wipe out the indigenous tradition. And so you can see very, very direct parallels. That's a really dramatic one, but there are others as well. And certainly the concept of devil worship is one that functioned very much along those ways. When you talk about the conquest of the plains and the religious persecution that followed that under the reservations with the missionaries and the state, the federal rule of the reservations, they were confiscating medicine objects. They were destroying them, burning them. Collectors were carrying them away from impoverished people who sold them for food because they were being systematically starved. Or, they were just outright taken and stuck in the Smithsonian or wherever. And so you have, it's a religious persecution. It's a cultural repression that has gone on here. And it has its roots in what was done in Europe.
I did want to kind of wrap things up here, and thank you very much for your time. Before we let you go, where can our readers and listeners find out about future talks and courses and books?
Yeah, well, for the talks, and especially for my webcasts, you can look on suppressedhistories.net. That's my website, my main website. And if you would like to get a copy of Witches and Pagans, which is available from Valletta Press, go to valletta.net, VELEDA.net. And then the other thing I'll mention is I'm coming out with a goddess coloring book, and that will be out in the next month. And
That's
so, so, you can always look at my Facebook page, also Suppressed Histories page on Facebook, or get on the mailing list, which there's a sign up for on my website, so you can be notified about webcasts. We're going to be doing one this month on goddesses of Mexico, and next in October we're going to be doing ancient treasures of African women. So there's a lot of visual talks that I'm starting to offer digitally, so you get to see the images and hear about them all at once on your own computer.
Yes, for anyone who's not familiar with Max's presentations, she has a lot of great images and historical evidence and drawings to illustrate the history. Well, thank you very much for talking with us today.
Thanks so much for your time. We really appreciate you coming on here. Had a great conversation, and sorry if I rambled a little bit, but this is a topic that gets me really fired up.
You raised some interesting points.
Thank you for joining us here on the Conscious Community Podcast. We'd like to thank Max Dashu for joining us. We would also like to thank our sound engineer, Matt Manna of InnerCircleProducer.com. Spencer and I will return next episode with Alyssa Relier of the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention.
Our interview highlights will appear in the print edition of Conscious Community Magazine, and the full transcripts will appear on our website, ConsciousCommunityMagazine.com. If you're interested in sponsoring the podcast, or would like more information about advertising with us in print or online, please contact me by email at spencer@ConsciousCommunityMagazine.com. That's Spencer@ConsciousCommunityMagazine.com, or call 630-492-0831.